get started anyway. Okay, so what we're going to be covering today is we'll take a look at an introduction to the brain. We will look at teenage brain development. We'll look into the fight, flight, freeze, fawn response. Then we'll think about how this is impacted by the window of tolerance. We'll look at reframing sleep and reframing behavior, and then also look at some top tips. Okay, so in terms of the brain, around 20 to 30 years ago, we did think that the brain development happened within the first few years of our life. But more recently, research shows that actually, even though our brains don't get any larger in size after early adolescence, they do continue to remodel and regrow and develop throughout our lives. So in terms of neural connections, neural pathways, and brain structure, this all kind of changes and develops throughout our lives, and we can call this neuroplasticity. But specifically in terms of for teenagers, during adolescence, we know that the brain undergoes an entire remodel, so from the back of the brain to the front, and that lasts for around a decade. So there are a lot of changes going on for teenagers in their brain as they go through puberty and as they get older. So three really important things to remember when we're thinking about the brain, specifically for teenagers, is that the structure and activity in a teenage brain is really different to that of an adult brain. So just like a young person going through puberty and the physical changes that they go through, everybody is developing in a different way at different speeds. So you could have a whole room of 13-year-olds and all of their brains might be at a slightly different stage of development because everybody goes through development at a different time and a different speed and at different stages. What we also know is that adolescents are operating with what we might consider like an incomplete kit or toolbox to manage their emotions and their mental health. So we might want to reframe the expectations that we have for teenagers because they physically might not have the skills that they need to be able to deal with certain situations or deal with them as well as perhaps an adult could. Neurologists do consider adolescents to finish at around 25, but this can be up to the late 20s. So there has been some research which says that the brain does continue to grow and develop quite a lot until around the age of 25. But we know that that can be later for some people as well. So we're going to take a bit of a deeper look at the brain now, and this bit gets quite scientific, but this is the most scientific part. So we'll start with the parietal lobe. So the function of this is that it takes information from the senses and processes language. And we know that that tends to be fully developed in adults around the early 20s, which means that for teenagers, they might struggle to process sensory information as well as an adult could. So this might mean that they're more sensitive to things like sounds or smells or tastes or lights and that kind of thing. We've also got the prefrontal cortex, which is for logic and reasoning, problem solving. So this is the part of the brain that we really need when we're faced with a problem or a difficulty, and we really need to think carefully about that. Or if we're having an argument or a disagreement with somebody, this is the part of the brain that might help us to think really carefully about what we might need to say or how we might want to say it. In adults, this tends to be fully developed, which means that for teenagers, it is still developing and they might be prone to high-risk behaviours or what adults might perceive as high-risk behaviours because they just don't have as much of a capacity as adults to really think carefully about the situations that they're putting themselves in. We've also got the amygdala, which forms part of what we might call the downstairs brain. So we might sometimes think about our prefrontal cortex as being our upstairs brain and the amygdala and the hippocampus as being our downstairs brain. And the amygdala, the function of the amygdala is to help us to survive, to keep us safe. And this activates our stress response when we feel like we're under threat, which we'll come on to more a little bit later. As adults, we might rely on this less because we do have more use of the prefrontal cortex. So we can think a bit more carefully about things. And what this means for teenagers is that they're likely to be more impulsive and also more sensitive to threat and danger. So teenagers might perceive things as being a danger to them, even when they're maybe not. We've also got the hippocampus, which works in function with the amygdala because this is the hub of memory and learning. And this is still growing during the teenage years. And that means that teenagers are still kind of learning how to process memory effectively. And we'll come on to that a little bit more about why that might impact the stress response. And then we've also got the ventral striatum. So this is the reward center. And in adults, this tends to be fully developed, but in teenagers, what that means is that they might be more driven by short-term reward than future consequences. So if we're thinking about what we already said about the prefrontal cortex, they have less of that kind of logic and reason and problem solving and thinking things through carefully, but they have more of this kind of reward-driven they have more of a reward-driven sense in their brains. So this might look like teenagers kind of consuming a lot of short-form content or engaging in, again, what we might see as risky behaviours. Okay. Have we got any questions so far in the chat or anything?
We don't, not at the moment.
Okay, thank you. So what we know then is that our brains have evolved with an inbuilt alarm system. So this helps us to respond to danger. So it's there for a reason. It's there to keep us safe. So throughout our days, throughout our lives, our eyes, ears, and our other sensory organs are sending information to the amygdala. So that amygdala is always on call. It's always vigilant, ready to detect danger when it happens. Or what we'll come on to a little bit later is maybe when there isn't actually a danger there, but it is perceiving it to be a danger. Either way, if the amygdala senses that danger, it sends a message to activate the fight, flight, freeze, fawn response, which we'll talk about a little bit more. But once that response has been activated, the prefrontal cortex, so that part of our brain that helps us think carefully, is unable to reason with the danger, and it essentially goes offline. So this is just a completely automatic response that happens in our brain. It's not a choice. A young person isn't choosing not to think about something carefully and to react. Their brain, the part of their brain that helps them think carefully, is literally shutting down and they're acting as if they're in danger. And this can really lead to them feeling quite emotionally overwhelmed as well. What we know about teenagers is that the teenage brain is a lot more sensitive to this response as well. So it's more likely to happen to them than it might be to an adult. So we've talked about the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala there, but we also know that the downstairs brain includes the memory scanner, so the hippocampus. And this is, like we said, filing our memories, helping us to learn what those memories mean, helping us to kind of make sense of the world. Sometimes that can found memories in the wrong place, or it can place huge emphasis on memories, which can make us really think that things are dangerous when they're not necessarily dangerous. So an example of this might be that a young person's had a really negative experience at school, and then the next time they think about going to school, we might know as adults that actually that thing that happened to them is really unlikely to happen again, or it wasn't quite as scary as maybe their brain has remembered it. But we know that their brain is placing a big emphasis on that, and it's shutting down that thinking brain, and it's making them really think that going to school is a scary and dangerous situation from them. And it can sometimes be helpful to think back to a time that you've had a negative experience somewhere and what happened the next time you went to that place. It's likely that your brain reminded you of what happened last time, which is a really rational and normal response because it's your brain trying to make sure you realize, remember this happened last time you were here. Do we need to do anything to keep safe this time? And whilst as adults, our thinking brain might be able to activate there and ration and reason that actually that was quite an unlikely situation. It's probably not going to happen again. That kind of thinking will be a lot more difficult for a teenage brain. What we know as well is that when we're stressed or tired, that fight, flight, freeze, fawn response is activated much more quickly and more frequently. And we'll take a look at what some of those responses might look like. So when we experience the fight response, this might feel like an urge to attack the threat. So this might look like kicking or hitting, screaming or shouting, pushing away the threat or not wanting anyone to be near them, spitting, throwing things, clenching fists, struggling to breathe, behaviours that we might perceive as being quite challenging. And it can sometimes be because anger feels a bit of a safer emotion to display than more vulnerable emotions. So sometimes our fear, worry, or anxiety does come out as what might perceive to be anger. We can also experience the flight response, which can be described as trying to escape from the threat. So this could look like completely running away from the situation or doing anything to get away from the danger. And that could also involve running away without concern for safety as well. If we remember in that moment, that thinking brain isn't online. So that part of the brain might make us think running away is not going to be safe right now, is not necessarily there. But it can also look like restlessness, fidgeting, using a phone or eating or sleeping or gaming, kind of like trying to get away from that threat, being withdrawn, darting eyes, daydreaming or dissociation as well can sometimes happen here. And it could also be complete avoidance of the situation. So it could be thinking about the situation and not even doing it in the first place, because the body's keeping us, and the body and the brain are working together to keep us away from that threat or what's perceived to be a threat. So we can also experience the freeze response, and this is making the threat believe that you're not there to reduce the level of danger. So this can look like holding your breath, an increased heart rate, shutting down, feeling unable to move or talk, or feeling like you're stuck, escaping your own mind again by daydreaming. Some people report feeling quite numb as well in the freeze response, feeling like you're mute or an inability to kind of talk or have any verbal communication. Can also be disassociation. Can also be functional freeze, which is what we describe as somebody who's able to go through their day, but they don't really have any motivation or emotion, and they're kind of still in that activated stress response, but they feel quite frozen and they're struggling to actually do a lot of the things that they normally do, even though we might perceive them to be doing what they normally do. We can also experience the fawn response, which we might describe as kind of trying to make friends with the threat in order to survive. And this is the lesser known response within the stress response. And what we might see in this response is young people appeasing to the threat. They might make jokes in order to kind of fit in or go along with things, or so that they don't kind of stick out. They might be quick to follow instructions or use humor and jokes as a kind of defense mechanism. It can often be seen as people pleasing, so things like apologizing quite a lot and shifting blame. With this one, what's quite common is that this might describe kind of young people who present really differently at school and at home. So you might have a young person who is dysregulated quite often at home, and that's really obvious. They might experience a lot of the fight, flight, or freeze response at home. And then when you kind of discuss that with school, they might say, we don't really see any of that at school. They get along with everything. They're the model child. They're doing everything they're supposed to do. They're getting on with things really well. And it could be that that young person actually is experiencing that fawn response when they're at school, and they're kind of doing everything they can to just get by and get through. And sometimes we can see young people when they've been doing that is when they do get home from school or whatever that situation is, they they might have even more of the other responses, or they might be feeling a bit burnt out. Sometimes young people don't know they're in distress as well. When they're in the fawn response, it's a lot less obvious and it's a lot less talked about than the others. And it is also seen more in girls and women, people who are neurodivergent, and people who've experienced trauma as well. The most important thing to remember here is that the threat response is an automatic brain and body response. It's not a choice. So in that moment, when that child is experiencing that fight, flight, freeze, fawn response, they're not choosing to do that, and they're not choosing which one they do either. They don't have the ability to think clearly or logically because of what's going on in their brain. So it's not the time for lesson learning. I'm sure you can all think of an experience where you've tried to have a conversation with somebody immediately after or during when they're feeling dysregulated, and it doesn't go very well. And then everybody ends up getting more dysregulated. And that's because that part of our brains that we really need to help us in those conversations is just not yet back online. And it can take around 20 to 6 minutes for that to come back online, but that can be even longer again for children who are neurodivergent or for children who've experienced trauma. So it's really important to wait until everybody feels really regulated again and is able to use their thinking brains, their prefrontal cortex is back online, so that you can have effective conversations that are going to be helpful moving forwards. Another thing to remember is that the amygdala and the reactive brain, the survival brain, is always looking out for danger, and sometimes it can warn us about things that are real. So we need it there to protect us from danger, but other times it makes us react to things that aren't actually a real threat. So I like to use the smoke alarm analogy for this. So we all have a smoke alarm in our houses, and we need them there because we need them to go off if there's a fire. But how many times has the smoke alarm gone off when there hasn't been a real fire? Maybe somebody's burning something in the kitchen, or maybe there's steam coming from the shower that's setting off the smoke alarm. And that's just a bit like our amygdala sometimes. They can be overly sensitive and they can make us react to things that aren't really a threat. A key thing here is just teaching your young person about this response and helping them to recognize that sometimes they might think they're in danger even when they're not. And that's a really good first step to helping them overcome that. And here's just some examples of what might trigger the threat response. So things like taking a test, going somewhere new, somebody saying something mean, or having to speak to somebody new or do something new, getting in trouble, feeling criticized, and that might be actual criticism or just perceived criticism, being in a busy place, fear of failure, feeling embarrassed, not understanding something, or something not going as expected. Each individual will have their own triggers, and it's really important to work with your child to identify those triggers. But these are just some examples. Okay, do we have any questions or any comments before we move on?
No, not yet.
Okay. So during the teenage years, the brain's building and strengthening connections that are used the most. So this can be thought of as a bit of a use it or lose it process. So the more a young person practices something, the stronger the brain pathways are going to become in that area. So this is why it's really important for teenagers to learn skills that help their mental health and well-being, because the more that they practice those skills through their adolescence, the easier they're going to be able to retrieve those skills and use those skills when they're an adult. And this is skills like expressing emotions, understanding feelings, managing thoughts, recognizing their strengths, coping with challenges, and helping them understand what helps them to cope with challenges too. And also having positive relationships so they can really experience what that's like and how it helps. So what's our role then as an adult? So as adults, we can frame this transformation that teenagers go through in a positive and empowering way. So it's really tempting to, in the media and everything like that, being a teenager is often perceived as, a really negative thing. It's like teenagers are really stroppy and moody, and it's horrible being a teenager or living with a teenager. And it can be really helpful to think about how unhelpful that framing it that way might be for that young person. They might get into a bit of a shame and guilt spiral, which can then set off their amygdala and their stress response. It's important to remember it's a time of increased vulnerability, but also a time of great opportunity. Like we said on the previous slide, teenagers are in a really good place to learn skills and develop skills because their brains are working on overdrive to really learn that new information and take that in. It's really important that we motivate young people if we want them to be able to take ownership of their actions and to help them understand what's going on in their brain so that they can then work with it rather than against it. It can also be helpful to remember that this brain change happens to every human animal and it is natural. It's not a choice. Okay, so we're going to talk about the window of tolerance now. And the window of tolerance is a way of considering how well we can cope with the general ups and downs of day-to-day life. So if this diagram here on the page shows an optimal level of tolerance, an optimal window of tolerance. And what this means is that we've got an optimal amount of being able to deal with the ups and downs of daily life. So as you can see on this picture, the squiggles on the screen demonstrate the ups and downs that we might go through on a normal day or a normal week. And if our window of tolerance is big enough, we can cope with that and we can stay in a regulated zone and in a kind of able to manage and deal with our emotions without our thinking brain going offline and without activating that stress response, whilst also experiencing those ups and downs. What we do know though is that if our window of tolerance is too small, that means that the normal ups and downs of day-to-day life will lead to us becoming either hyper-aroused or hypo-aroused, which means that we either feel too much or feel too little. So we want to try and do everything we can to help teenagers increase that window of tolerance so that they're able to deal with things better and that they're able to cope better with the tricky situations that they're probably going to be in throughout their lives. Some of the things that we can do some of the things that teenagers might do or might experience that decrease that window of tolerance, which means that it's decreasing their ability to cope, might be having poor sleep and feeling tired. We'll talk about sleep a little bit more later as well. Having unhealthy or inconsistent relationships, poor physical health, big life events or transition and change, having an unbalanced diet or feeling hungry or dehydrated, spending time in stressful environments, bullying and loneliness, or it could also be linked to the developmental stage they're at as well. So what we know for teenagers is that their window of tolerance is likely to be a bit smaller as they go through puberty anyway. Some of the things that we can do to help teenagers look after their brains and to increase that window of tolerance, which means that we're increasing their ability to cope with the normal ups and downs of day-to-day life, is making sure that they get quality sleep and enough sleep, making sure that they have supportive relationships, supporting them to eat a balanced diet and making sure they're eating and drinking enough, taking regular breaks, having time alone when needed, feeling like we can support them to understand and express their emotions, making sure we're drinking enough water and doing enough physical activity, helping them to practice coping strategies, and making sure that they have somebody to talk to that they can trust. So all of these things can support a teenager to increase their window of tolerance and be better able to cope with things that happen. When we're in the hypoarousal state, so that's when we're feeling low or shut down or numb, we maybe feel like we don't have enough energy. This is some ideas of things that we can do to upregulate. So it could be moving your body. So I always say, you know, exercise doesn't have to be something that you hate to do. It can literally be anything that moves your body, releases endorphins, that makes you feel good. So anything that your young person likes to do that involves moving their body and gives them some kind of enjoyment, gives them that boost of energy as well. And it can be really helpful to ask them, how did you feel before you did that? And how do you feel now? So that we can recognize the impact of doing that. It can also help to listen to upbeat music. So putting on your favorite playlist, dancing around, combines both the moving in your body and listening to the music with that one as well. But music does have the power to change our mood, and listening to upbeat music can help to boost energy levels too. You can also encourage a young person to engage in stimulating activity, so something that challenges their brain or stimulates their senses, solving puzzles, playing games, doing something creative. It can be really, really tempting when you feel in a state of hypoarousal, so you're feeling low and shut down. It can be really tempted to think that what you might need is to shut yourself away and take rest. Sometimes that absolutely is what our bodies need when we're in that state. Maybe we've done, you know, I've had a really, really busy week, or we just really do need some time to do nothing, to calm down. But sometimes when we're in that state, we actually need to do something to help ourselves increase our energy levels and boost our mood. And it's really helpful to help your teenager work out whether they're in a hypoarousal state where actually they need to take a break, or whether they're in a hypoarousal state and actually they could do with taking part in an activity that could help to boost their mood and energy levels. Another way they can do that is also to get some sunlight. So natural light is really powerful in helping regulate your body's natural rhythms and also boosting those energy levels as well. So when people are in the hyperarousal state, so that's one that feels like we've got too much energy, so they might be feeling anxious, excited, hyperactive, annoyed, angry. We might need to engage in activities that help us to slow down, might need to regulate our breathing and find some kind of relaxation. So deep breathing is something that's really helpful and something that teenagers sometimes reluctant to take part in. We do actually have a really helpful video on our YouTube channel which explains the science behind why deep breathing is really helpful for us to calm down. But deep breathing basically activates the relaxation response by slowing down the heart rate, increasing oxygen intake, and also reduces tension in the body. It can also be helpful to do some mindfulness or meditation. But with both of those things, in fact, with all of these things, it's really helpful that the young person doesn't do any of these for the first time when they're feeling in that state of hyperarousal. They know these strategies. They have these strategies. They know exactly how to do them. They know they've got all the resources available to be able to do them, and they can just pull on them and draw on them as soon as they need them. So with mindfulness and meditation, that helps us to focus on the present moment and let go of distractions. We can also use guided imagery, so use an imagination to visualize peaceful scenes, which helps to induce positive emotions. We can also do progressive muscle relaxation, which involves tensing and relaxing different muscle groups, and that helps release tension. We've also got some really nice videos on our YouTube channel, which are kind of guided progressive muscle relaxation as well. It can also help to listen to calming music or spend time in nature and doing anything that counts as self-care. So anything that involves taking care of yourself. And here's just some examples of what deep breathing might look like, some strategies that you could teach our young people. But again, on our website, we've got loads and loads of pages and pages of different strategies, of different breathing techniques. So help your young person find which one works for them, because they'll try some of them and they'll hate them and they think it really doesn't help them. And then they might find other ones that actually work much better for them. Okay. Have we got any questions or any comments before I keep going?
No, we don't.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
So we'll talk a little bit about sleep now. So adolescents going through, teenagers going through adolescence need around 9 to 10 hours of quality sleep. So that word quality is really important there as well, making sure that the environment is purposeful for sleep. So it's a dark room, there's limited noise, and there's, the right temperature in the room, and they feel comfy and cozy and able to have good quality sleep. But we really need that quality sleep to feel recharged and able to function. And what we know when we think back to the window of tolerance is that lack of sleep really, really significantly affects that window of tolerance. And I'm sure everybody listening to this will be able to relate to that. If you don't have good enough sleep, you find that you're a lot snappier, you're a lot less able to deal with things. And that's even as adults. So for teenagers whose brains still are not fully developed, that's even harder as well when they have that lack of sleep. What we do know for teenagers is that the secretion of the sleepy hormone melatonin happens later, and it can be as late as 1 to 2 a.m. And the secretion of the chemicals that help us wake up, like cortisol and adrenaline, can occur much later in the morning or afternoon, which is why we sometimes find that teenagers during school holidays, their sleep schedule gets later, they go to sleep later and wake up later. And that can be really, really difficult for them when they're at school, because the school schedule often is working against the chemicals in their body when it comes to sleep. So that is just something to bear in mind, and recognize that it might be a lot harder for teenagers to get to sleep and to wake up than it might be for adults. What we do know is that without sleep, young people can face challenges with memory function, emotion regulation, coordination, multitasking, executive functioning, and their mood and motivation as well. So it really can have a significant impact. And if your young person has challenges with sleep and they're putting lots of things in place and it's really difficult, I'd say the first step is just being really kind to yourself and them being really kind to themselves and recognizing that this is why I'm finding things a little bit more difficult, because I'm not getting that sleep, rather than worrying too much about not being able to get that amount of sleep or that quality sleep. These are some ideas as well that we can use to kind of reframe sleep and help young people to understand how sleep actually affects their brain. So we might say things like, your brain takes signals from light, both natural artificial light and blue light, and this is what tells your brain to feel sleepy or wakeful. So that can help them to understand how maybe phone use and things like that might be impacting their sleep, or spending time outside as well, how that might positively impact their sleep. You could say, imagine how calm and energized you'll feel tomorrow if we can help your brain to feel sleepy earlier this evening. So it's really that kind of scientific focus. It's not go to sleep because I said so, or I'm just telling you that sleep is going to be helpful. It's actually thinking about the brain. How is our brain going to feel if we get to sleep a little bit earlier, or if we just feel a bit sleepy, or if we spend more time relaxing this evening? We could also say things like, you're not lazy, your body clock's releasing sleepy chemicals later in the night. Again, if we make people feel ashamed of feeling the way they do, it doesn't often help them make changes. It actually prolongs that the time it takes to make the change, because we go into that guilt and shame cycle. So helping teenagers to understand that they're not lazy, the chemicals are sometimes perhaps working against their schedules, can be really validating. We might also say something like, tonight, why don't you think about how you can help your brain know what time it is an hour earlier? So again, linking it back to the brain and helping them to understand what we can do to help the brain. I also really like to use this phone analogy when we think about looking after our brains, because most young people have a phone and they understand that, if they were going out for a long day, they would want to check that the phone's got enough battery. They might close down apps that are draining their power. They might actually plug it in to charge. They're going to check that their phone is working well. looking after their mental health is really similar. So things like making sure we get sleep, doing exercise, taking breaks, spending time outside in nature, talking to other people and managing our stress are just like charging up your phone and keeping it running smoothly. When stress levels stay high for too long, when we don't take care of ourselves, our battery can become drained. And that's when we find it harder to concentrate, manage emotions, solve problems, or enjoy things. So one activity that you can do with your young people is help them to think about things that charge their battery and things that drain their battery, and making sure that they have an equal amount of those things in their day. So they haven't got a day full of battery draining activities with absolutely nothing that's going to recharge their battery. And using that phone analogy can be really relatable for them as well. We also want to make sure that we're reframing behaviour for young people so that when young people are in threat mode, they understand that they're using reactive, unhelpful thinking and behaviours, but we can reframe that. So we can think about what actually is going to help us in this moment, rather than, like we said before, making us feel guilty or ashamed of how we're feeling or what we did. It can help us to feel like we understand and we feel validated and have a strategy that we can use moving forward. So instead of saying something like, "What's wrong with you?" Maybe your teenager's taken part in something, or they've exhibited a behaviour that we think actually wasn't very helpful. Instead of saying, "What's wrong with you? Why did you do that?" Which is really tempting to say when somebody does something. We might instead say, right, what might that be telling us? What might this behavior be telling us? What do you need right now? So finding that protective intention in the behavior. So recognizing that actually maybe they reacted like that because their brain recognized a threat, because they're worried about a friend, or because they haven't had enough sleep, or because they're feeling hungry. So then that then helps them to problem solve that and come up with a solution so that they can act on that a bit better next time. And again, that conversation might need to happen once that thinking brain's come back online rather than in the moment. If a young person is struggling with something, or you think something's coming up and it's going to make them anxious, instead of saying, "Well, this is going to make you anxious," we could say something like, "This is going to take a lot of bravery." So framing it in a much more positive way, or asking them, "What can we put in place to help you to do this?" So we're naming that difficulty, and then we might use a bit of a step-by-step approach to overcome it. So we can also use a ladder as well, which means that we're going to help young people to take really gradual, small steps to face the thing that they're finding difficult. Also helps them to understand if there's maybe any accommodations that they need from school or from home, or that they can put in place themselves to help them access things. Instead of saying, "How are you going to cope when it comes to exam time?" we want to be really validating there and saying something like, "I can see how hard this is," and reminding them of times when they've done things that were difficult in the past by saying things like, "You can do hard things, here's the proof. Remember when you did that?" We can also use what we call curious questioning there as well to ask them so they can come up with the answers for themselves. We can say, "What happened when you did this?" or "What happened when you were faced with this problem in the past?" And helping them to recognize themselves that actually they were able to deal with that situation that was tricky. Okay, so we're coming to an end now, so we'll just go through some top tips to summarize. So we really want to make sure that we're focusing on the young person's strengths. We want to help them find and talk about their strengths, and a strengths-based approach is really going to help the young person to understand their brain and to work with their brain rather than against it. Make sure that when mistakes have occurred, we use that as a learning opportunity rather than making them feel guilty or ashamed for experiencing that mistake, helping them understand that mistakes are a really normal part of life. We we also want to help them understand how mistakes can be used to help them function in the future. So actually mistakes are a real learning opportunity. We want to also resist the urge to fix emotions for our young people, which is really, really difficult because as adults, we want to jump in and help young people when they're going through a difficulty. But actually, just validating their emotions and sitting with them can be a lot more powerful than jumping in. The issue if we jump in to fix children's problems all of the time is that that becomes addictive, and then they rely on us more and more. Really helpful to discuss the brain development directly with young people as well and refer to it in terms of their emotions. So help them understand, it happens to everybody. They're not alone. And especially when they've done things that they might not be proud of, or they're feeling things that they'd rather not be feeling, it can be really helpful to normalize it and link it back to the brain so they understand why they're feeling like that or why they behaved like that. And finally, just making sure that we have empathy. As difficult as it can sometimes be, try and remember how it did feel to be a teenager. Nobody was a perfect teenager. We all made mistakes, and having that empathy, and even within reason, sharing some of those mistakes that you might have made with your child can sometimes be really powerful for them to see you're human as well. Okay, so we'll finish there. Is there any questions, Naomi, at the moment?
Don't have any questions at the moment. No.
Okay. We'll finish there then, but you can find us on Instagram or Facebook, on YouTube. We've got plenty more resources on there. Thank you.